Cek, cek. Apakah suaranya sudah terdengar jelas, Bapak Ibu ya?
Jelas, Mas. Alhamdulillah jelas.
Jelas ya, Baru. Oke. Bu, kita mulai. Sudah pas pukul 9. Sudah hadir juga sejumlah 86 partisipan secara online. Bisa, Prof? Oke. Oke. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam
Waalaikumsalam
warahmatullahi
warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Amin. Nahmaduhu wa nasta'inuhu wa nastaghfiruh wa na'udzubillahi min syururi anfusina wa min sayyiati a'malina. May yahdihillahu fala mudhillalah wa may yudhlil fala hadiyalah. Asyhadu an la ilaha illallah wa asyhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu. Allahumma shalli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad. Alhamdulillah pada pagi hari ini saya mewakili Bapak Ibu teman-teman Asosiasi Program Studi Magister Ekonomi Syariah Indonesia. Hari ini kita akan mengisi hari-hari pada mungkin sebagian Bapak Ibu yang sudah selesai ujian akhir atau masuk dengan belajar langsung kepada salah seorang ahli yang kebetulan pada bulan Juli ini hadir bersama kami di UIN Jogja, khususnya di Fakultas Ekonomi dan Bisnis Islam, UIN Sunan Kalijaga, Yogyakarta. Beliau berkenan untuk share dengan kita sekalian di asosiasi, sehingga Bapak Ibu dosen Prodi MES dan juga para mahasiswa Prodi MES di Indonesia itu bisa mendapatkan berbagai pandangan, insight, dan juga experience dalam bidang ekonomi internasional, secara khusus hubungan internasional. Background beliau memang international relation. Oleh karena itu, Bapak Ibu sekalian, semoga nanti kurang lebih sampai jam 11, terbagi dalam 2 termin, sekitar 45 sampai 1 jam, beliau akan memaparkan presentasi beliau. Nanti setelah itu akan ada Q&A. Oke, sedikit informasi, sedikit perkenalan. Let me try to introduce Juergen Rueland from University of Freiburg, Germany, Prof. He has come here to Sunan Kalijaga for about a month in July 2025. We have a workshop here, especially in research methodology. His research experience mostly in international relations. But of course, one of the issue in the international relation is about international economic. So this morning, he will talk and discuss to us in the title of Global Economic Governance between Deadlock and Informality. The role of victimhood narrative, legal capacities, and domestic politics. Hopefully, all the participants, not only the lecturers, but also all the students, can get a lot of information, knowledge, and his experience to more understand about international relation, especially Indonesia, between Indonesia and ASEAN, Indonesia and other part of the world. And lots hot information about international trade. Maybe he also can say a little bit about international economic. So let's start our agenda this morning by reciting Basmalah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. For your information, all the participants who has come online this morning, that we are in Faculty of Islamic Economics in Sunan Kalijaga University, also gathered in this room. So this event will be held hybrid, not only online, but also offline. So I want to show you the participant right there. So Please say hello to the participant. Okay, that's the participant. And this is Prof. Rueland beside me. Okay, that's the introduction for me. So right now we start to get the lesson, public lecture from Professor Juergen Rueland. Time and place is yours, Prof.
Ja, terima kasih banyak, Pak Rofur. Dan selamat siang yang terhormat. Terima kasih untuk kemungkinan mempresentasi kuliah umum di sini. Dan topik ini Global Economic Governance between Deadlock and Informality, the role of victimhood narratives, legal capacities and domestic politics. Yeah, welcome to the on and offline participants. And I think the presentation I will present to you this morning strongly draws from a review article that I recently, maybe that doesn't work. Yeah, I think
full thing, you know?
maybe sorry for the interruption.
Atau dari atas sini. Ini apa ini? Display. Oh. Ya itu bukan Mas. Oh iya.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Sorry for the interruption. Now, what I was going to tell you was that the presentation that I offered to you this morning strongly draws from a review article that I published together with a colleague of mine, Mrs. Angela Geck, in the journal Global Governance. And this review article has basically the objective to review most recent literature that pertains to the field of global economic governance. In fact, these are three major books that have been published in recent years. One by an Indian scholar, Amrita Nalika, who reviewed proceedings at the World Organization, the WTO. Then a book that has been published by an American lawyer, trade lawyer, who particularly looked into the activities and the agency of rising, emerging economic powers such as China, India, Brazil. They responded to the inequalities in the international economic system. And finally, a book that has been published again by an American, now working in Spain, in Barcelona. He wrote about the issue of informality in international economic relations. The question he raised was, why is it that informality is becoming increasingly relevant and characterizing international organizations in the field of international economic relations. These are basically the main books around which my presentation will be scaled today. Again, yeah, I think it should work now. And here you see what is the objective of my presentation. It responds to the question, how does the recent IPE literature, internal political economy literature, explain the accelerating decay and fragmentation of multilateralism, global economic governance, and what are the new insights that this literature provides. And that also unites quite strongly to the workshops we have had here, and showing some new trends in studying international economic relations. Now, all three books are providing a strongly interdisciplinary perspective. They draw from economics, they draw from international political economy, international relations, legal studies, and even anthropology that has been used for these analyses that I will speak of today. Now, let's perhaps start with the problem that we currently encounter in international relations, especially economic actions, and that is that the post-Cold War liberal international order, LEO as it is shortly called, is definitely in a process of severe decay. That most of the norms and rules of that order are increasingly under fire and are questioned by quite a number of international actors and states. So that means that the strongly teleological nature of that order and the ideas behind it no longer hold. What do I mean by teleological assumptions? It is basically that adherents of the liberal international order believed that this is a continuous process that started at the end of the Cold War and led to an increasing legalization, contractualization, and constitutionalization of international relations, that international relations and especially economic interactions will be relegated to institutions. They will be negotiated in institutions, in international institutions, and that as a result of that, over time, there will be a process that gradually starts to resemble the domestic order of advanced liberal democracy, so that everything is done within institutions, that it is based on law, that it is not violent, that it is peaceful, and that was the optimistic outlook at the time after the end of the Cold War. And probably many of you know this maybe already infamous book of Francis Fukuyama, The End of History, in which he claimed that the time of ideological struggles is over. The liberal worldview has succeeded, and we will further develop that liberal order on a global basis, in a global perspective. That does not longer hold today because, as I said, the liberal international order is under fire. And why is it under fire? Because starting in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a rise of new powers that have been assembled in the BRICS institution or organization, if you want, like China, like India, like Brazil. These are the most important ones, but South Africa belongs to it, and Russia is probably not a newly rising power, it's a re-emerging power. And also Indonesia is now a member of BRICS. So these countries were dissatisfied with the liberal international order because, according to their view, the international economic order in particular was unjust, was heavily weighted in favor of the advanced northern Western powers, and the rules that the liberal international order created were strongly westernized, and due to that they believed that Western powers used the international order in order to establish a global value hegemony, which has a clear hierarchical shape, and they contested this and increasingly demanded that they will be represented in international bodies, in international organizations, in particular in the international financial organizations like the IMF, like the World Bank, and others. And they were, as I said, dissatisfied with that order. Probably one of the gravest mistakes that Western countries have made at that time was virtually not responding to these demands by rising powers and to accommodate them in international organization. Later on, they started to invite various countries on a ad hoc basis to G7 or G8 meetings before Russia left or was ousted from the G8. But that, of course, could not really satisfy these countries, which displayed a highly impressive economic growth and were not adequately represented according to their economic weight in international organization. So they demanded a better representation in this order, in institution of global governance. That had quite strong repercussions. Some of these repercussions were that, unlike as claimed or foreseen by the liberal international order, international institutions were no longer bodies where cross-border problems, global, regional cross-border problems were settled or were negotiated, where solutions have been worked out in a cooperative basis. That no longer worked. And instead, many of these institutions and organizations have become arenas for intensifying contest about four things: membership, decision-making procedures, norms, and mandates. Just to give you a very simple example, what I mean by that, for instance, if you look at the UN, everybody knows the UN. So there is a quite strong demand, especially of southern country, to be better represented among the permanent members of the Security Council of the UN. Presently, you have 5 members, and except for China, all where from northern countries and southern countries always complain that the UN Security Council basically represents the power distribution of the time immediately after the Second World War, but not today's distribution of power in the world. So membership is contested. Decision-making procedures is contested as well. As you know, the permanent members in the UN Security Council have much greater powers than the ordinary members of the UN who are members in the UN General Assembly. So there is contest about decision-making powers. Or if you look at the IMF, the power is very skewed seemingly along economic performance of the country, but in reality it is not, because most rising countries have not been represented according to their economic weight. It's in more recent years that countries like China also have been accommodated better in line with their economic weight. The norms, of course, are contested. Again, take the UN. There's always this struggle: what kind of norms should prevail? Is it the national sovereignty norm, which is part of the UN Charter, or in line with the liberal international order, further developments that also have, in certain cases, behind the border effects on various countries. This is also strongly contested, and of course also the mandates, what is allowed to certain members and what is their task within a organization and whatnot. So that is heavily contested, and the result of that is that there is a paralyzing of the capacity to address global and regional cross-border problems. Institutions don't work anymore for the purpose they have been created. This is a big problem that we presently encounter. And a consequence of this discontent with the international order, rising powers resorted what has been called in the literature counter-institutionalization. That means, and I come back to that somewhat later, that they create their own institutions that rival existing institutions, like the IMF or so. Just think of the Asian infrastructure investment bank, that often considered as an institution rivaling the World Bank and the IMF. So the effect is a fragmentation of international institutions, and what political scientists call the emergence of regime complexes. For instance, one regime complex would be in environmental issues. A lot of organizations have been said that somehow deal with various aspects of the environment and climate change, but often they overlap, they do the same things, and it is not clear what exactly are their authorities and competences. So this is adding to the problems, and since that is the case, there is also an increasing informalization of institutions, meaning that states no longer invest in international institutions, because investment in international institution is expensive, makes a lot of causes a lot of effort. But if you create an institution only to balance the power of another institution, the life of this institution probably is short-lived, and that makes sense to invest heavily in such an institution that might disappear in a few years. So informatization, non-binding, very pragmatic decision-making process that usually characterizes many of these institutions, plus what we see right now, especially in trade politics, the tariff policy of the United States, which is a sort of American unilateralism, which despises or at least downgrades the significance of international institutions. And so in the literature, you find concepts like multilateralism is increasingly contested, and others like myself, we would call it diminished multilateralism, because it's a type of multilateralism that is void of most of the institutional capacity and effects that you would expect from a well-working institutional system. So that is the situation that we find right now. And based on this very general description of the situation, I would like to introduce some of the ways how the literature, the new literature on international political economy responds to that, and what are the novelties in the discourse on international political economy. So let's start perhaps with the way these books and these authors theorized economics and international political economy. Many of you who are themselves economists are probably well trained in positivist and rationalist theories. If you look around in economics, you would find an overwhelming attention and predilection of to use positivist and rationalist, materialist theories. Also in the IPE literature, though not as much as in economics, you have this strong trend for materialist, rationalist approaches that are taken in order to analyze international political economy problems, or are used as analytical frameworks. Now, this kind of positivist, exclusively positivist approach has been challenged in recent publications, and very celebrated economists like Paul Collier or Schiller and some that social psychologist Kahneman and Tversky, Nobel laureates who had a lot of influence on the thinking of people like Collier and Schiller. That led to changes in recent publications, in the sense that also hardcore positivists admitted that the picture that a positivist approach provides from economic phenomena might not be complete, and that there are also norms, identities, that there is knowledge that shapes economic decision, not only rational choice. Rational choice might explain a lot of things, but not everything. And that's why they strongly argued that these kind of reflexivist versions of theory building, of theories, should also play a role in economic theorizing, and especially theorizing on international political economy. And that led to an approach that could be called analytic eclecticism. We have discussed that here in the workshops extensively. Analytic eclecticism is an approach that seeks to leave the mainstream approaches, the schools of thought that are deeply ingrained in scholarship, and select components of existing theories and rebuild the theory composed of components from different theoretical traditions, because especially when it comes to non-Western regions, this is an approach that is promising a greater explanatory scope than if you only stick to the mainstream theoretical schools. So they combine various approaches, and Gregory Schaffer, one of these three authors that I mentioned, for instance, combined legal reason, which is derived from the school of political realism in international relations, which is a strongly rationalist and positivist perspective of international relations. And he combined that historical and sociological institutionalism, which are reflexivist school. Historical institutionalism, for instance, would claim that decisions that have been made at a certain critical juncture will continue in their effect for many years and decades even after they have been made. There is always a path dependency until a new critical juncture comes and there will be change. But before that, you have this path dependency. And he so built his theoretical approach around sociological institutionalism, which comes from organizational sociology, and would claim that organizations always orient themselves to the front-runner organization. If one organization has proven to be very successful, very formative, then other firms or other organizations, they imitate, they emulate the model of this success. And that's also a core argument of Gregory Schaffer, that he says that rising powers like Brazil, like China, like India, have to a quite considerable extent emulated the way Western countries do their trade negotiations in international bodies, and have acquired virtually the same capacities, the same legal capacities over time. And that refers to a large branch of research in international relations that we call diffusion research, which means that ideas travel, and something has become quite successful, as I said, in one region, will travel to other regions. Perhaps one particular example, you know very well about imitation and diffusion is ASEAN. Many people say, wrongly, in my opinion, that ASEAN is imitating the EU. EU, in the literature at least, is celebrated as the most successful regional organization, and is also a very successful regional organizations. And then if you look at some of the terminology of ASEAN institutions or bodies, they are similar to those in the EU. And that's why people say ASEAN is imitating the EU. But nothing is more wrong than that. But at least you see what I mean, that there is certain diffusion of successful concepts that are taken over, but then it's a different kind of thing. What is inside these institutions that are seemingly adopted, and often you have quite a lot of differences there. But again, coming back to the concept of analytic eclecticism, that is used in these studies. Also, Amrita Nalika, the Indian scholars, does that. Maybe the other way around, starting from more reflexivist position, building on narrative economics, and she claims that narratives have been developed by rising powers, plus many southern countries in their in line with them, that have changed the power distribution in WTO, and this very powerful narrative is called the poverty narrative, which claims or which expresses or creates pressure on developed countries to be more compromising vis-à-vis southern countries in trade negotiations. So you see, there is a lot of movement in theorizing, and that also leads to an associated question, and that question is whether the discipline IPE and IR and maybe also economics might be on the way towards a global perspective in their research, because what is quite agreeable in many sectors of the economic and especially IR scholarships is IPE and IR are basically an American social science. That is one famous concept coined by a scholar named Stanley Hoffman. And what he wants to say is that many social sciences, including economics, IPE, IR, are heavily westernized. The view, the angle of analysis, basically Western. The experience for theoretical conclusions are mainly drawn from Western historical experiences, and the non-Western world, the global South, is basically marginalized in these views. They have a subaltern status, and often Western scholars only use experiences in the southern part of the world in order to test their hypotheses or their theories, and also the cooperation between Western and Southern scholar is asymmetric. Western scholars often do the theorizing, and they use their colleagues in the global south in order to collect empirical data, which they can't because they are not familiar with the language, they are not familiar with the culture and the conditions in non-Western countries. And so what has come up in recent years are increasingly demands for a more inclusive way of doing research in the social sciences, a universalistic way of doing research, but that integrates the experiences, the historical experiences, the practical experiences in non-Western countries, and that has been called pluralistic universalism. That's a concept coined by Amitav Achayan, also an Indian scholar living in the United States. And of the books that are in the background of my presentation, especially Gregory Schaffer and Amrita Nalika very much contributed to this goal because they read developments in important economic international organizations like the WTO, like the IMF, like the Basel, what is it called, Institution of Settlement or something like they use it very much from a southern point of view, and it's Gregory Schaffer who emphasizes the significance of positionality, from which perspective or from which perspective you analyze things. And he himself said he cooperated with scholars in the respective countries, Brazil, China, and India. It is important to highlight their views, the respective countries and their government's view on international economic issues or trade issues in particular. And Amrita Nalika, for her part, is highlighting especially the leadership of emerging powers in fighting the inequalities and injustices of the international political order. So all of these, not all, but two of these three books very much and decidedly took a non-Western perspective at issues of international trade. Now, I briefly spoke about that already, but I come back to this issue of changing power relations in global economic governance, and all three books contributed to that question. I mentioned already that emerging powers are increasingly frustrated with their institutional marginalization, and that as a result of that, as a consequence of that, they created rival institutions, and one of them is BRICS. We mentioned it already, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank, which has been set up by the BRICS country, or what has been called the Contingent Reserve Agreement, which is a agreement helping southern countries in terms of liquidity crunches to overcome these problems. Now, we have talked about the deadlock in global institutions, and global institutions are increasingly replaced either by regional trade agreements here in the region. Recently, you have the RCEP, which is a very large, perhaps the largest free trade area in the world, or bilateral trade agreements, as, for instance, the EU is pursuing them with ASEAN countries since a region-to-region free trade area many years ago failed. So the European Union has been trying to establish bilateral free trade agreements with ASEAN countries, and they have succeeded in such by concluding free trade areas, bilateral free trade areas with Singapore and with Vietnam. With Indonesia, it's under discussion, and one high-ranking government official in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs recently told me that he expects that the bilateral free trade area with the EU will be concluded this year. Let's see how it works, but there are other with Malaysia and Thailand also underway, and it has to be seen what is the effect of that. But the point is that all these regional and bilateral trade agreements are weakening multilateralism, and also Western countries often act in opportunistic ways, singling out what is best for them. But that's what probably all countries do. So what we also observe is the weakening, what I mentioned at the beginning, of the liberal international order, but not a complete change of the global order. Very often we can see that emerging countries are adopting many parts, many norms and rules of the existing order, but they repurpose them, they reshape them according to their own interest and objectives, to make them more amenable to their own economic interest. And that's why it is also said in the literature that the international economic order is in a process of hybridizing. So it's still of the old order, but repurposed by rising powers. And part of that is in particular that changed the game. It was a game changer, at least according to Gregory Schaffer, that they developed their trade negotiation capacity and also developed new powerful narratives that enable to change international the power equation. Now, what is very important in these analyses also is the domestic dimension of global economic governance. This is nothing new. I think economists know that quite well. Also in IPE, it's something that is totally new. In IR, not at all as well. There are various approaches like neoclassicalism or liberalism, constructivism, or what has been called second image reversed approach. They all have the domestic dimension on their screen. However, for one of these three authors, the domestic level is the most important one, is the driving factor, in fact, the changes towards informality. So it's a little bit a different approach than I suggested earlier. It's a complementary lens of that view, Roger briefly summarized, would argue that especially the domestic politics in Western countries, in OECD countries, has shown two major developments. First of all, the rise of a lot of regulatory stuff, a lot of regulatory norms, and also changing power distributions in domestic politics to the high increase of called veto players, so making decisions increasingly difficult to achieve, and the increasing regulatory dimensions of domestic politics have the effect that basically new institutions, new organizations have been set up that are run by bureaucrats, and bureaucrats are not keen that they are controlled. They seek to insulate them from controls. They want to maintain their decision-making autonomy, and therefore they switch to increasingly informal institutions that are not under the control of the parliament or government, and also politicians who are elected and usually lead government institutions face an increasing opposition from veto players, and therefore all seek to switch to informal institutions because they also withdraw decision-making processes from their opponents. So it's basically a twofold process of formality that is even strengthened or even reinforced by the international arena. Stronger powers usually are more in favor of informality than weaker powers, because greater powers can use their power accordingly to influence decisions if they rely that on informality. Also, what is in this literature highlighted is the increase of non-state entities, especially non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations that have been grown tremendously since the 1980s, in the last 40 years, and hence an increasing number of frequency of public-private interactions between the government, firms, think tanks, universities, non-governmental organizations. And Schaffer shows very diligently how these countries, China, India, Brazil, used the interaction between the government and the private sector in order to increase their trade negotiation capacities, in so far as they provided funds to get better training in these matters, to cooperate with external agencies, firms, international law firms, for instance. So opening up a transnational dimension of cooperation that highlighted again the importance of non-state entities. I come back to that a few minutes later. And that also showed two ways of strengthening the legal capacities in trade negotiations in an inward-out perspective and outward-in. Outward-in is the pressures that have been created by the international system, legal litigation, for instance, that went awkwardly for rising powers, and as a result of that, caused a learning curve by these countries, strengthening their legal capacities by very much focusing on the capacities, on the performance of law firms, and especially trade experts. That is the inward-out dimension of it, that within the countries, competences are strengthened, and therefore they, over time, became increasingly successful in litigation, winning a lot of cases against countries like the US or the EU, before were much more powerful. That brings me to the transnational dimensions of global economic governance. Transnational relations, just to repeat a famous definition by Thomas Risse, are regular interactions across national boundaries when at least one actor is a non-state agent. As said, we have seen a worldwide proliferation of civil society organizations, the emergence, as critical IPE scholars say, of a transnational capitalist class. Some of the literature, especially Gregory Schaffer, but also Amrita Nalika, analyze this transnational interplay between international organizations, states, and private actors, and show how these interactions led to a empowerment of previously weaker institutions. What Schaffer displays is a transnationalism from above, led by the various governments of the country, whereas Amrita Nalika shows a transnationalism from below, how civil society organizations, for instance, in the WTO meeting in Seattle in 1999, combined their efforts together with some countries, creating the poverty narrative. Should we stop for a moment?
Yeah. Yes, stop. Please quiet for listening the national anthem.
Yeah, thank you. We stopped the position of Amrita Naliko and her transnationalism from below. That very well describes how civil society organizations joined with governments of southern countries and highlighted so-called narrative, poverty narrative, always emphasizing the situation of these countries that keeps them stagnating in poverty if there will be no compromising attitude from the economically more powerful countries, and that has risen, especially after the end of the Cold War. Before, the basic and strong conviction was that poverty in southern countries is not something that is the northern or western countries should be held responsible. This is internal weakness of the countries in the global south, and that's basically a modernization theory based assumption, and that was very powerful for very much of the Cold War period, and it was only after the end of the Cold War that this was increasingly challenged, and that especially in the Seattle WTO meeting, there was this conclusion of a strong coalition that covered northern, southern civil society organizations, plus many southern governments in the past were not very amenable to coalitions with civil society organizations because they considered them mainly as critics. But in this case, here there was a coalition forged that finally led the development round of Doha, and where at least it was promised that from hence on the concerns and demands of poorer countries, of developing countries, will be taken into account when it comes to trade negotiations. So Nalika shows how this transnationalism below emerged. And final point, informality. I mentioned that already several times. It is not a completely new issue in IPE or in international relations. There are a lot of people who say that informality is an asset because it enables flexible decision making, it allows pragmatic decisions, and there is no rigid order. There is always some space for exception if the exceptions are needed in order to create compromises or whatever. And it is also said that informality is very helpful where you have a context of great diversity. So the best example, for instance, is ASEAN. ASEAN is very proud on its informal procedures and decision-making process. And one of the major reasons for this is there's a great diversity of economic performance, political system, culture, and so on. And that makes it better to have a pragmatic approach to decisions. Critics would argue that informality does not really commit the members. It's a non-binding way of doing things. It leads to frequent policy changes, and it is That is also one thing that is often criticized when it comes to ASEAN. Policy making on the basis of the lowest common denominator. So these two positions are there, are struggling all the time, and so that is basically one of the problems now also facing in the field of international economics, global economic governance. And the diagnosis is, as I said in the beginning, that this way of legalization, contractualization, and constitutionalization is increasingly giving way to what is called soft law, informal governance structures within and around formal international organizations that lead to institutional fragmentation and what is called forum shopping and informal minilateralism. As you can, for instance, observe, the US is practicing a lot of informal minilateralism, like institutional like AUKUS in the security domain, or the Quad. They are examples of minilateralism, but you also have it in ASEAN. For instance, if you look at the institutional setup in mainland Southeast Asia, where a lot of overlapping sub-regional organizations have been founded over the last 20 or 30 years. That's what is meant by and by minilateralism. And this is just to give you a definitional distinction between hard law and soft law. Soft law has a high degree of flexibility, is not binding, is not precise, and is, that's particularly important, not enforceable. And that leads to forum shopping, where countries pick and choose among the institutions and mechanisms that best fit their individual agenda. For just to give you one example, back in the last century, there was this struggle or this contest: should developing countries be members of the GATT system, General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade, or should it be rather focused on UNCTAD, which is a trade organization that has been set up under the framework of the United Nations. Especially, yes, in the time after World War II, where developing countries thought their interests are better covered than in the GATT system, which was basically established by the Americans and by the British after the Second World War. So you have now a situation of increasing forum shopping, and that's what I mentioned earlier. This kind of informality is explained as Roger in a two-stage way. On a domestic perspective, and in an international dimension, where powerful states prefer informal institutions. What is perhaps a bit worrying is that in his quantitative analysis, he uses mixed methods and uses qualitative and quantitative approaches. In his statistical evidence, he shows over a period of 50 or 60 years after the end of the Second World War, there has been a tremendous increase in formal institutions from 7% after the Second World War to now more than 40%. And even more worrying is the fact that he found out that the informal institutes are less effective in global economic governance, in the fulfillment of the task, than formal organizations. In case of formal organizations, he found that 70% matched for their task, performed the task to a major extent, while formal organizations, 74% did not match their task, did something else than they were created. This brings me to the conclusion of my talk. What all the studies do is, and many others that I have not mentioned, confirm as well, is the winning of global economic governance as we have experienced after the end of the Cold War with the creation of WTO. The studies all highlight certain causal factors that in the existing body of economics, IPE, IR, have so far been under-theorized, such as the strengthening of trade capacities of emerging powers, the empowering effect of the poverty narrative, as explained by Amrita Nalika, that enabled southern countries to better coalesce in their for a more just trade system, and also highlight the inadequate response of informal institutions to the problems, to the pathologies of accelerating globalization, the ineffectiveness in solving emerging cross-border problems, the increasing informalization of economic global governments, but also that increasing inclusion of global South perspectives gives a more complete picture of international economic governance. These studies are more nuanced than the mainstream studies that we know so far, because often they use nested analysis in the sense of Evan Lieberman, combining various approaches, quantitative, qualitative approaches. They resort to interdisciplinary approaches and use eclecticism, analytic eclecticism for their studies. Of course, this is not the end of the research on global economic governance. A lot of blind spots remain, especially in the work of Charles Roger. He only focused on the OECD countries, and it's very important to see whether the mechanisms that he unpacked all hold true for non-Western countries. A whole agenda of research is still there, and he openly admitted that, and also finding out what are the most significant factors explaining what leads to the decay of global economic governance. And I think also there are new methodological approaches where you could combine various factors like qualitative comparative analysis that has been not applied to these kind of studies. So there are still a lot of options open for you and me, and I look forward to contributing to that together with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Rueland, who has give a clear explanation to us about the international relation, especially in international equation, start from the post-Cold War and then the rise of many institution, formal institution, informal institution. Until right now, we have not only multilateral organization, but also we have unilateral. Meanwhile, the complexity of the international relationship can be understood only by single theory. It must be elaborate so many theory to understand the complexity of international trade. Okay, thank you again. Thank you very much for Prof. Rueland. And right now we have more than 150 participants online.
Oh.
Stay with us from the beginning of this session until right now. Let me say hello and mention some of them. Our colleagues we have our friend from UIN Banten, from West Java, our friend from UIN Gusdur, Pekalongan. You're right, Pekalongan, ya, UIN Gusdur. Also, we have our head of the association, Kang Evi Syarifuddin from UIN Banten. Hello, Kang. Our friend from IN Bone from Sulawesi, South Sulawesi. Our friend from Sumatra, we have UIN Jambi, Universitas Ma'arif Lampung. Our friend also from Kediri, East Java. IAIN Palopo. We have also our friend from Palo, from Sulawesi, from Kalimantan. We have our friend from Palangkaraya, UIN 1, Tulungagung. And also we have and many others. Win Raden Mas Said Surakarta. Okay, Bu Siti Aisyah, I mentioned you. Okay. Win Jakarta, of course, we have some colleagues here. Unsima, Umala Lampung. Our friend from IAIN Gorontalo. Gorontalo is a province in Sulawesi Island. IAIN Gorontalo, IAIN Bone, Gorontalo also. Yes. Institut NU Lampung. Gorontalo Universitas Muhammadiyah Gorontalo, thank you very much. And may our friends, colleagues who has joined us this morning. They are waiting your slide. Maybe you can share your slides in the committee, Mas Diki Umar. Ya, bisa nggak Mas Diki langsung biar nanti share di sini, dibantu slide. You can directly send your slide to Rizky Umar, and then he will send to the audience right now. Yeah. To our friend from online participant, you can also receive the discussion this morning through the YouTube online. I will send the. Oh yeah, we have also our friend from UIN Syahada Padang Sidempuan, not Sumatra. Okay, we have some question from the participant online. Now we go to Q&A session. You can type your question on the chat. Also, you can directly ask your question to the Professor Rueland by raising your hand. Maybe some of you can raise your hand and tell to the professor the question. But we have one. Masih bisa nampilin ini? Oh ya. Oke. Mohon ditunggu, Prof. Rueland sedang mengirimkan file PowerPoint. Nanti akan disampaikan ke tim kami. PBB silahkan jika ingin bertanya bisa langsung tuliskan di chat ya, bisa dalam bahasa Indonesia maupun dalam bahasa Inggris. Ya, Win Sumatera Utara juga hadir ini. Sudah dikirimkan? Di refresh. Sudah. Coba dicek. Okay. And now we go to the Q&A session. We have question from the participant. Yeah. Right. What you can see here? Can you see it? The first question. The first question come from.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. And I would like to answer, but I'm not quite clear what blacklist you mean. What is the context that you mean by blacklisted?
The first question is come from Rois Hildan Argayuda. Assalamualaikum. Hildan.
Can explain
What is the response to the list of countries that are blacklisted? Maybe you can explain what do you mean with the countries that are blacklisted?
Where blacklisted?
Were blacklisted by the US or by other institution maybe? Maybe you can give additional information. We go to the second question mungkin Mas If. Jadi yang pertanyaan kedua. Kisti Amalina, Win Palupo. In the context of global economy, which is often dominated by major powers, developing countries frequently position themselves as victim to advocate to their interests in various international forums. My question is, effective victimhood narrative in strengthening the bargaining position of developing countries, especially given limited legal capacity and also domestic political pressure. And could this approach potentially backfire? Backfire? What was? Geser tulisannya apa? Kursor. backfire in an increasingly informal, complex landscape of global economic diplomacy. For instance, maybe we can understand about relation between US and Indonesia, US and many other developing countries.
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. I think several perspectives to this question. First of all, this victimhood narrative was very successful initially, especially after the failed Seattle WTO meeting, when developing countries built a strong coalition, and the new trade liberalization round, the Doha round, could only be established after the developed countries, the rich northern countries, succumbed to the pressure of developing countries that this round should focus on development issue. In that sense, it was very successful. There was a strong leadership by large emerging powers like Brazil and India. They were basically leading this coalition building, and it created a lot of successes and also successes in the negotiation that later on, or in the Doha round, until to the point that there was this deadlock of the Doha round and no more advancements that also satisfy the non-Western countries could be achieved. And that is the weakness of the victimhood narrative, that's the argument of Amrita has overused. It has been used for each and everything issue in trade negotiations, and then finally it did not work anymore. Even developed countries used it. Trump has used it in order to justify his tariff policy, saying that it is geared towards lift out of poor American workers from their party that was infringed on them due to the unfair trade relationships in the globe, which benefited other Western countries and countries of the global South at the expense of American workers. So there was an absolute overuse of this argument, and that paved the way that it did not work anymore. And of course, with the increasing fragmentation of international economic relations, it's even losing more of its effectiveness, because as we could see in recent trade negotiations, also developing countries are pitted against each other in trade negotiations. It's not yet anymore a unity where emerging rising powers have the same economic interest like least developed countries. And you can see that in the increasing number of so-called Gs, G15, G32, G90, G7, and G20, and so on. So that makes it increasingly difficult to use a narrative for solidarizing all these countries. And I completely agree with you. If you insinuate that currently the concept of poverty victimhood is no longer very effective. That's admitted by the author herself, by Amrita Nalika.
Okay. The next question, Mas. Okay. Okay, question from Rizal Ferdiansa from Universitas Ma'arif Lampung, Sumatera. Given that the US came to a liberal international order after Cold War, emphasizing democracy, free trade, and multilateralism, what explained the Trump administration should shift towards the
Yeah, well, in many parts of the world, we are witnessing the rise of a right-wing populism, and populists are not really strong adherents to certain liberal values that you mentioned, like democracy, free trade, multilateralism, good governance, and so on. You could mention many more. Populists are strongly geared towards maximizing the benefits for their own country. They have a very narrow view of international relations that is basically geared by the national interest. National interest is the premium for populism, and they do not really follow any kind of ideology, and they are just opportunistic and pragmatically making decisions, context-based, moving into many directions whenever it needs to be done. And therefore, I would say that this is a strong danger and jeopardizes a liberal international order based on rules, like especially middle powers always adhere, because there is not much space for international cooperation. International cooperation is seen as a sign of weakness, and it's not something that is very much valued by populists. And so, in my view, this kind of unilateralism, pushing through the utmost benefit of one's own countries without concern for the situation and conditions in other countries is a major problem of the world order, and will lead to a lot of conflict, contest, and chaos.
So you also believe that the policy that Trump's driven by national interest, even though in the domestic, in the U.S., so many people in the U.S. protest the Donald's policy.
Yeah, well, I think that is probably one of the issues that the American government do not adequately consider. It backfires also to a considerable extent, because serious economists say that this kind of tariff policy is causing a lot of inflation in American, rising prices for consumers. And in fact, it's precisely the clientele that supports Trump domestically that will suffer most. And that's also the situation we have in Germany, where we also have a strong right-wing populist party that is supported by a lot of people. They do not see that the policies they promise will not in the end benefit because, for instance, they call for the exit of Germany from the EU, like the Brexit, yeah. But they do not consider the fact that EU cooperation is a complex thing, and that the German economy in the end benefited a lot from membership in the EU because a large percentage, I forgot how much, but a large percentage of the trade, the foreign trade of Germany is done within the EU, and if that is now given up, the economy would really fall into a deep recession, and especially the low-income segments of the population would suffer. So I think that this kind of populist recipes might sound very simple and persuasive in the beginning, but the world is complex, and you have to take that into account, and then you easily that the recipes that are proposed by populists who always offer simple solutions to complex things that they does not work.
Yeah, there is always a controversy in every policy, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, next on the go to the next question. Okay, some of our colleagues from East Indonesia have been there because they have to perform Sholat Jumat, maybe have from Sulawesi and other region around there. And now the next question from Ahda Inayati from UIN Banten. In light of the current challenges in the global economic governance marked by institutional deadlock and increasing informal mechanisms, research themes and approaches would you recommend for Islamic economics students, particularly in exploring ASEAN's role and rest within this evolving landscape? Maybe you can add the role of the OIC, maybe? Organization of Islamic Cooperation, this formal institution, which part can be taken by the OIC. This
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. I would propose that students of Islamic economics could, for instance, study to what extent the ASEAN economic community goes hand in hand with values and principles of Islamic economics, because many critics would argue that the ASEAN economic community is very much based on neoliberal precepts, and that I myself, I have written something about the ASEAN economic community. My conclusion is that especially large conglomerates with an outward-looking perspectives had the major influence on the ASEAN economic community and how it was shaped and what kind of objectives it should fulfill, whereas the basis of ASEAN economies, which are small and medium scale industry, or even micro scale industries, have had virtually no role or only a limited participation in the discussions on the ASEAN economic community. Then it would also be very much interesting to explore how non-Islamic members of ASEAN would respond to the ASEAN economic cooperation would be shaped more along the ideas of and the values of an Islamic economy. For instance, Vietnam or I don't know, Thailand, how they would respond to that, whether they would be agree, and what could be compromise solutions in achievement. That spontaneously could be some topics that could be studied, but of course I should know more about the specifics of the literature. I've of course prepared and read stuff for this mission here in Sunan Kalijaga, but of course there are more questions that could be asked. Thank you.
Okay, what do you think, Prof? What do you think about the role of the OIC in the international relation, especially in the international economy?
Yeah, well, the OIC is a organization that creates or seeks to create unity among Islamic countries.
Consists of more than 50 countries.
Yes, yes. So I think within the domain of majority Islamic countries, I think the OIC could do a lot to propagate the ideas of an Islamic economy, because to my knowledge, the acceptance of the values and principles differ among the membership of the OIC. There are countries that have far advanced, some Arabic countries have far advanced on that way. Indonesia, Malaysia are also following that path and creating elements of an Islamic economy. Others have gone not so far. So I think it's a good forum for deepening the knowledge and the information on the virtues of what an Islamic economy could achieve socially, but in terms of economic performance. I think that is probably something which a mainstream economist is still questioned or open, whether an Islamic economy provides the same opportunities for economic growth than a capitalist, neoliberal capitalist economy. I think these kind of issues could be well discussed in this forum, because I guess there is a lot of expertise in the respective countries. Pakistan, for instance, is also one of these countries that expand with Islamic economy.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other question? Okay. Tadi the last one from Miss Andriani from IAIN Gorontalo. To extend to blacklist imposed on certain countries in the economic development and international, and what are the humanitarian implications for the population in this country?
Yeah, I'm still I still do not understand to which blacklist you refer. I mean, blacklisting is always something that is questionable. We have in international economic relations, in line with the of aggression of Russia against Ukraine, is the sanctions regime. But that sanctions regime is basically focusing on Russian companies. So it's not a global or a developing related blacklist. So I still do not understand fully what black you mean.
Yeah. Okay, next, there is a comment from Pak Bambang from Basnas Cilegon. Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. We would like to share the extent of industry involvement in the development of the Sharia economy. A comment from the participant. And we also comment the lack of awareness in the lack of awareness campaign for Sharia compliant behavior in carrying out both business transaction. Okay,
Yeah,
the topic is out of the
Ada gangguan ya? Suaranya tidak tertangkap. Suara tidak tertangkap di Cilegon.
around Indonesia, more than 130 participants.
Wow.
And with this event, corporate that they have so many benefit from this virtual